On the evening of March 18, 1314, as the sun set over medieval Paris, the screams of a burning man echoed across the Seine River. But this was no ordinary execution. This was the deliberate destruction of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man whose final moments would shake the very foundations of European power. What you're about to discover about Jacques de Molay's death will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, and reveal a conspiracy so deep that its consequences still ripple through history today. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay were not just fire. They were the culmination of 7 years of torture, political manipulation, and one of the most sophisticated character assassinations in medieval history. When witnesses described his execution, they spoke not just of a man dying, but of an empire burning with him. The Knights Templar, once the most feared and respected military order in Christendom, were being erased from existence in the most public and humiliating way possible. But the true horror of de Molay's execution lies not in the flames themselves, but in the calculated cruelty that preceded it. For 7 long years, this once powerful leader had been systematically broken down, tortured until he confessed to crimes he never committed, only to recant those confessions in a final act of defiance that sealed his fate. The political machinery that destroyed him was so ruthless, so complete that it would serve as a blueprint for state-sponsored persecution for centuries to come. What makes de Molay's story particularly chilling is how modern it feels. A powerful organization destroyed by manufactured evidence, forced confessions, and media manipulation. King Philip IV of France didn't just want the Templars' wealth. He wanted to obliterate their very memory, to make an example so terrifying that no institution would ever dare challenge royal authority again. The execution of Jacques de Molay was not justice, it was theater performed for an audience of kings and commoners alike. In the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, on a small island in the Seine, Jacques de Molay faced his executioners with a courage that surprised even his enemies. But the true terror of his final moments goes far beyond physical suffering. This was a man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting Christian pilgrims, who had fought in the Holy Land, who had commanded respect from kings and popes. To see him reduced to a political prisoner, his reputation destroyed, his life's work branded as heretical. This was a horror more profound than any torture device. The island where de Molay burned still exists today, though few visitors realize they're standing on the site of one of history's most significant executions. Medieval chroniclers wrote that the flames seemed to burn differently that night, that de Molay's voice carried further than should have been possible, and that his final words, a curse upon his persecutors, hung in the air long after his body had turned to ash. Whether you believe in curses or not, the historical record shows that within a year, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were dead, their deaths as mysterious as they were sudden. This is not just a story about medieval justice, it's a window into the darkest capabilities of organized power. The destruction of Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templar represents a turning point in European history, the moment when the old order of warrior monks and crusading ideals gave way to the cold calculation of early modern statecraft. Understanding how and why de Molay reveals uncomfortable truths about how power operates, how narratives are controlled, and how even the mightiest can be brought low by those who master the art of political destruction. Tonight, we'll follow Jacques de Molay from his rise as Grand Master to his final defiant moments on that island in the Seine. We'll uncover the torture techniques used to break him, the political forces that sealed his doom, and the lasting impact of his death on European history. But be warned, this is not a story for the faint of heart. The real horror of de Molay's execution lies not in the flames that consumed his body, but in the systematic destruction of truth itself. The Knights Templar emerged from the bloody chaos of the First Crusade in 1119. Founded by 9 French knights who took vows to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, what began as a small band of warrior monks would, within 2 centuries, become the most powerful financial and military institution in medieval Europe. Their distinctive white mantles bearing red crosses became symbols of Christian military might, striking fear into Muslim armies, and commanding respect from European nobles who desperately needed their services. By the 13th century, the Templars had evolved far beyond their original mission. They controlled a vast network of properties across Europe, operated the medieval world's most sophisticated banking system, and commanded fleets of ships that dominated Mediterranean trade routes. Kings borrowed money from them. Pilgrims entrusted their wealth to Templar banks, and entire kingdoms relied on their military expertise. The order had become so wealthy and influential that they effectively operated as an independent state within the fragmented political landscape of medieval Europe. Jacques de Molay entered this world of power and privilege sometime in the 1260s, rising through the ranks of an organization that valued military prowess, administrative skill, and unwavering devotion to their interpretation of Christian duty. Born around 1243 in the Burgundy region of France, de Molay came from minor nobility, wealthy enough to afford the equipment and education required for knighthood, but not so elevated as to have other paths to power. The Templars offered ambitious young men like de Molay something unique: the chance to serve God while wielding real political and military influence. The medieval world that shaped de Molay was one of constant warfare, where the line between religious devotion and political ambition was often deliberately blurred. The Crusades had been ongoing for nearly 2 centuries, creating a culture where violence in service of Christianity was not just acceptable but laudable. The Templars represented the ultimate expression of this mindset: monks who were also elite soldiers, bankers who were also warriors, diplomats who were also ready to die for their faith. This contradictory nature would ultimately contribute to their downfall. De Molay's rise to Grand Master in 1292 came at a crucial moment in Templar history. The last major Crusader stronghold, Acre, had fallen to Muslim forces in 1291, effectively ending 2 centuries of Christian military presence in the Holy Land. For an organization whose primary purpose was protecting Christian pilgrims and fighting in the Crusades, this represented an existential crisis. De Molay understood that the Templars needed to adapt or face irrelevance. But his proposed solutions, a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land and internal reforms to address corruption, would ultimately make powerful enemies. The political landscape of early 14th century Europe was shifting in ways that threatened all traditional power structures. Strong monarchs like Philip IV of France were consolidating power, challenging the authority of both the Pope and powerful military orders like the Templars. The concept of centralized nation-states was beginning to emerge, and there was simply no room in this new order for independent military organizations that owed allegiance to no king, and answered only to the Pope in Rome. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, was particularly well suited to exploit these changing dynamics. He was intelligent, ruthless, and surrounded by legal advisors who understood how to use emerging concepts of royal sovereignty to justify attacks on traditional authorities. The king had already proven his willingness to challenge the Pope directly, having orchestrated the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII in 1303. If Philip could destroy a pope's reputation, what chance did the Grand Master of a military order have against his political machinery? Most critically, Philip IV was facing a financial crisis that made the Templars' wealth irresistibly attractive. The king had borrowed heavily to fund his wars, and the Templars were among his largest creditors. Medieval chronicles suggest that Philip owed the order the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's currency. For a king already struggling to maintain his grip on power, the prospect of eliminating his debts while simultaneously seizing his creditors' assets must have seemed like the perfect solution to multiple problems. The charges that would eventually destroy the Knights Templar and lead to Jacques de Molay's execution were so shocking, so specifically designed to horrify medieval Christian sensibilities, that they could only have been crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of what would trigger the deepest fears and prejudices of the time. The accusations included denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and engaging in homosexual acts as part of their religious rituals. These charges were not random, they were carefully chosen to make any defense impossible. In medieval Christian Europe, even being accused of such acts was tantamount to social death. The brilliance of Philip's strategy lay in understanding that the specific nature of the accusations would prevent anyone from publicly defending the Templars without appearing to condone heresy themselves. The charges were designed to spread quickly through a society that thrived on scandalous rumors, creating a climate where the Templars were guilty in the court of public opinion before any trial had even begun. The legal framework Philip used to prosecute the Templars was based on recent innovations in canon law that allowed for the use of torture to extract confessions from suspected heretics. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had established new procedures for dealing with heresy, and the papal bull Ad Extirpanda of 1252 had explicitly authorized the use of torture in heresy trials. Philip's legal advisors understood exactly how to manipulate these relatively new legal tools to serve their political purposes. The choice of October 13, 1307, for the mass arrest of Templars across France reveals the meticulous planning behind the operation. Philip needed to move quickly and decisively to prevent the Templars from mounting any organized resistance or hiding their wealth. The operation required coordination across the entire kingdom, with royal officials simultaneously arresting Templars in dozens of locations. This was not a spontaneous action based on newly discovered evidence, it was a carefully orchestrated political coup disguised as a religious investigation. The timing also served important symbolic purposes. October 13 fell on a Friday, a day already associated with Christian suffering due to the crucifixion. By arresting the Templars on this day, Philip was symbolically aligning his actions with divine justice, suggesting that God himself was revealing the Templars' crimes. This kind of symbolic messaging was crucial in an age where political legitimacy depended heavily on divine approval. Jacques de Molay himself was arrested at the Paris Temple, the order's primary stronghold in France. Contemporary accounts describe the shock and confusion among the Templars, who had received no warning that they were about to become fugitives in their own homeland. Many had been going about their normal business, managing their estates, conducting banking operations, and planning military expeditions when royal officials appeared with arrest warrants. The sudden transformation from respected members of society to imprisoned heretics must have been psychologically devastating. The initial interrogations focused on breaking down the Templars' group identity and forcing them to confront the possibility that their entire life's work had been based on heretical principles. Inquisitors would begin by reading the charges in detail, emphasizing the most shocking accusations and demanding immediate responses. The psychological pressure was immense. These men had devoted their lives to defending Christianity, and now they were being told that their organization was secretly devoted to destroying it. The physical conditions of imprisonment were deliberately designed to weaken resistance before formal torture even began. Templars were kept in dark, cramped cells with minimal food and water. They were denied access to their fellow knights, preventing them from coordinating their responses or supporting each other emotionally. Many were held in chains, unable to exercise or maintain the physical strength that had been central to their identity as warrior monks. The torture techniques used against Jacques de Molay and his fellow Templars were drawn from the well-established practices of the medieval Inquisition, refined through decades of use against other suspected heretics. The most commonly documented method was the strappado, a procedure that involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and then hoisting them into the air by their wrists, often with additional weights attached to their feet. The excruciating pain was caused by the dislocation of shoulder joints and the gradual tearing of ligaments and muscles. Medieval inquisitors understood that psychological torture could be even more effective than physical pain. Victims would often be shown the instruments of torture before their use, allowing their imagination to amplify their fear. The sight of the rack, with its elaborate system of pulleys and winches designed to slowly stretch the human body beyond its natural limits, was often enough to prompt confessions before the torture even began. The knowledge that resistance would only prolong the agony created a psychological dynamic that made confession seem like the only rational choice. The water torture, known as the question of water, involved forcing large quantities of water down the victim's throat while they were immobilized on an inclined board. This created the sensation of drowning while ensuring that the victim remained conscious throughout the ordeal. Contemporary accounts describe how victims would emerge from this torture with severely damaged throats, often unable to speak for days afterward. The psychological impact of feeling oneself drowning, while completely helpless, was designed to break down the victim's sense of control and self-determination. Fire torture was reserved for the most stubborn cases, often applied to the soles of the feet, where the skin was particularly sensitive. Victims would be restrained while burning coals or hot irons were applied to their feet, creating injuries that made walking impossible for weeks or months. The pain was described by survivors as beyond anything they had previously imagined. But more importantly, the permanent damage served as a constant reminder of the authorities' power even after the formal interrogation had ended. Jacques de Molay's initial confession came after months of this systematic abuse. The document that survives shows clear signs of a man who had been broken, not just physically but psychologically. His admission to spitting on the cross and denying Christ reads like the words of someone who had been convinced that resistance was futile, that the only way to end his suffering was to give his captors what they wanted. The confession is notable for its lack of detail. De Molay admitted to the acts but provided little specificity about when, where, or why they occurred. What makes de Molay's confession particularly tragic is that contemporary observers noted how his personality seemed to change during his imprisonment. The confident, commanding leader who had once negotiated with kings and commanded knights in battle was reduced to a hesitant, fearful man who seemed to doubt his own memories. This transformation was not accidental. It was the intended result of a torture program designed not just to extract confessions, but to destroy the victim's sense of self. The detailed records of Templar confessions reveal the sophisticated understanding of human psychology possessed by medieval inquisitors. They knew that physical pain alone was often insufficient to break strong-willed individuals like de Molay. Instead, they combined physical torture with social isolation, religious confusion, and the constant threat of even worse treatment. Victims were told that their suffering was actually God's way of purifying them, and that confession would not only end their pain but actually save their souls. The process of extracting confessions was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological pressure. Rather than torturing victims until they confessed and then stopping, inquisitors would extract partial confessions and then demand increasingly detailed elaborations. This created a dynamic where victims had to continuously invent new details to satisfy their interrogators, gradually becoming complicit in their own destruction. By the time de Molay signed his confession, he had been forced to participate so extensively in creating the narrative of his own guilt that retracting it would require acknowledging his own role in the deception. The legal proceedings against the Knights Templar represented a fundamental shift in how political power could be exercised through judicial mechanisms. Philip IV's strategy was revolutionary in its sophistication. Rather than simply seizing Templar assets through royal decree, which would have been seen as tyrannical, he used the emerging legal framework of heresy prosecution to give his actions the appearance of religious necessity. This approach would serve as a model for future monarchs seeking to destroy powerful institutions while maintaining an appearance of legal legitimacy. Pope Clement V found himself in an impossible position when Philip presented him with the Templar confessions. The Pope was already under enormous pressure from the French king, who had demonstrated his willingness to use force against papal authority during the Boniface VIII affair. Clement was residing in Avignon, effectively under French protection, and he understood that opposing Philip too directly could result in his own destruction. The Pope's decision to launch his own investigation into the Templars was an attempt to maintain some appearance of papal authority while ultimately giving Philip what he wanted. The papal investigation revealed the fundamental weakness of the Templar position. While many Templars retracted their confessions when questioned by papal commissioners, the damage had already been done. The detailed nature of the original confessions, combined with the legal precedent that confession under torture was still legally valid, if not immediately retracted, created a situation where denial was effectively impossible. The Templars were trapped in a legal maze designed to ensure their conviction regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Jacques de Molay's decision to retract his confession during the papal inquiry was an act of extraordinary courage that sealed his doom on March 18, 1314. When he was brought before a papal commission expecting to hear his final confession and submission. De Molay instead declared that the Templars were innocent of all charges, and that his previous confession had been extracted through torture. This moment of defiance transformed what was supposed to be a routine legal proceeding into a direct challenge to royal authority. The speed of Philip's response to de Molay's retraction reveals how carefully the king had prepared for this possibility. Within hours of the public retraction, royal officials had declared de Molay a relapsed heretic, a category that carried an automatic death sentence under church law. This rapid response was only possible because Philip's legal advisors had already researched the relevant precedents and prepared the necessary documentation. The king was not improvising. He was executing a plan that had been years in the making. The choice of execution site, a small island in the Seine River near Notre Dame Cathedral, was laden with symbolic meaning. The island, known as the Isle de la Cite, had been used for executions before, but the proximity to Notre Dame created a visual connection between the execution and divine judgment. Spectators gathering on the riverbanks would see de Molay burning against the backdrop of Christianity's most important cathedral in France, reinforcing the message that his execution was not just political but divinely ordained. The method of execution, burning alive, was specifically reserved for heretics and carried particular theological significance. Unlike hanging or beheading, which were seen as relatively quick deaths appropriate for secular crimes, burning was understood to offer a foretaste of the eternal punishment awaiting the condemned in hell. The prolonged suffering was not an unfortunate side effect, but an integral part of the punishment designed to demonstrate God's wrath against those who had betrayed the faith. Contemporary chroniclers noted that de Molay faced his execution with remarkable composure, using his final moments to reassert his innocence and call upon God to judge his persecutors. His last words, preserved in multiple independent sources, included a curse upon Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, predicting that they would be called to account for their crimes within a year. This final act of defiance transformed de Molay from a broken prisoner into a martyred prophet, creating a narrative that would outlive his executioners. The immediate aftermath of Jacques de Molay's execution sent shockwaves through European society that extended far beyond the specific fate of the Knights Templar. The systematic destruction of such a powerful and respected institution demonstrated that no organization, regardless of its wealth, military strength, or religious sanction, was safe from royal power when wielded with sufficient ruthlessness and legal sophistication. Kings across Europe took note of Philip's methods, recognizing that similar techniques could be used against other inconvenient institutions within their own realms. The fulfillment of de Molay's curse within a year of his execution became one of medieval Europe's most discussed supernatural events. Pope Clement V died in April 1314, just 1 month after de Molay's execution, reportedly suffering from a painful illness that had persisted since the Templar trials began. King Philip IV died in November of the same year, killed in a hunting accident that many contemporaries interpreted as divine retribution. The rapid deaths of both men gave de Molay's final words a prophetic quality that enhanced his reputation as a martyr. The legend of de Molay's curse took on a life of its own, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of persecuting innocent religious organizations. Medieval chroniclers embellished the story with supernatural elements, reports of mysterious lights over the execution site, strange sounds echoing from the Seine, and apparitions of de Molay appearing to his persecutors in their final moments. Whether or not these supernatural elements were true, their widespread acceptance reveals how deeply de Molay's execution had disturbed the collective consciousness of medieval Europe. The practical consequences of the Templar destruction were immediate and far-reaching. The order's vast wealth was supposed to be transferred to other military orders, particularly the Knights Hospitaller, but much of it simply disappeared into royal treasuries. Philip IV used Templar assets to fund his continuing wars and political ambitions, while other European monarchs followed his example by seizing Templar properties within their own territories. The precedent established by the Templar trials would be repeated throughout the medieval period whenever monarchs needed to eliminate wealthy institutions. The banking and financial services that the Templars had provided were suddenly absent from European commerce, creating economic disruptions that lasted for decades. Merchants who had relied on Templar letters of credit found themselves without reliable means of transferring money across long distances. Pilgrims who had deposited funds in Templar banks in Europe to be withdrawn in the Holy Land discovered that their money had vanished along with the order. The sophisticated financial network that had taken 2 centuries to build was destroyed in a matter of months. The military consequences were equally significant. The Knights Templar had maintained standing armies and fortifications across Europe and the Mediterranean, providing security services that monarchs had come to take for granted. With the order's dissolution, many regions became more vulnerable to banditry and military attack. The specialized knowledge of castle construction, siege warfare, and military logistics that the Templars had developed was scattered to the winds, weakening European military capabilities at a crucial period in the continent's development. Perhaps most importantly, the Templar trials established legal and political precedents that would be used to justify similar attacks on other institutions for centuries to come. The use of torture to extract confessions, the manipulation of heresy laws for political purposes, and the systematic destruction of documentary evidence became standard techniques in the royal toolkit. Future monarchs facing financial difficulties or institutional challenges would look back to Philip I's methods as a proven means of solving their problems. The cultural impact of Jacques de Molay's execution extended far beyond its immediate political consequences, creating a narrative template that would be repeated throughout European history whenever power confronted principle. The image of the defiant Grandmaster calling down divine judgment on his persecutors became a powerful symbol of resistance to tyranny, inspiring later generations of revolutionaries, reformers, and martyrs who saw their own struggles reflected in his final moments. The story of de Molay's execution became intertwined with developing concepts of religious freedom and the limits of royal authority. As European political thought evolved during the Renaissance and Reformation, the Templar trials were increasingly seen as an example of how secular power could corrupt religious institutions for purely material gain. Protestant reformers particularly embraced this narrative, using the Templars' fate as evidence of the Catholic Church's willingness to sacrifice truth for political expediency. The emergence of Freemasonry in the 18th century gave de Molay's legacy a new and unexpected form of immortality. Masonic traditions claimed direct descent from the Knights Templar, portraying de Molay as a martyr for the principles of brotherhood, religious tolerance, and resistance to tyranny. While historians debate the actual connections between medieval Templars and modern Freemasons, the symbolic importance of this claimed lineage has ensured that de Molay's name remains familiar to millions of people who might otherwise never have heard of medieval military orders. The French Revolution of 1789 provided perhaps the most dramatic example of how de Molay's execution continued to resonate in European political consciousness. When revolutionaries were looking for historical precedents to justify their attacks on the monarchy and the Catholic Church, they repeatedly invoked the Templars as an example of innocent victims destroyed by the corrupt alliance of royal and papal power. The execution of Louis XVI was explicitly connected to Philip IV's crimes, with some revolutionary pamphlets claiming that the king's death was delayed justice for the murder of Jacques de Molay. Modern historical scholarship has vindicated de Molay's final protestations of innocence, demonstrating through careful analysis of medieval records that the charges against the Templars were almost certainly fabricated. The consistency of confessions extracted under torture, the lack of any physical evidence supporting the accusations, and the clear political motivations of the prosecution have convinced virtually all serious historians that the Templars were victims of judicial murder rather than actual heretics. This scholarly consensus has only enhanced the Templars' reputation as martyrs to political ambition. The techniques used to destroy the Knights Templar have been recognized by modern scholars as early examples of what would later be called total war against civilian institutions. The systematic destruction of the order's records, the character assassination of its leaders, the seizure of its assets, and the persecution of its members represented a comprehensive campaign of institutional annihilation that prefigured similar efforts by modern totalitarian regimes. Understanding the Templar trials provides valuable insights into how sophisticated political persecution operates across different historical periods. The legend of Jacques de Molay has also found expression in popular culture, appearing in countless novels, films, and television shows that draw on the dramatic elements of his story: the fall of a mighty organization, the torture of innocent men, the defiant last stand, and the supernatural revenge against the persecutors. These cultural representations, while often historically inaccurate in their details, have helped keep alive the essential truth about de Molay's execution, that it represented a triumph of cynical political calculation over justice and human dignity. Standing today on the banks of the Seine River, looking toward the small island where Jacques de Molay was burned more than 7 centuries ago, one cannot help but reflect on the terrible price of unchecked power and the courage required to resist it. The Grandmaster's execution was not simply a medieval curiosity, but a cautionary tale that remains strikingly relevant in our modern world, where powerful institutions can still be destroyed by manufactured scandals and forced confessions. The most chilling aspect of Jacques de Molay's execution is not the physical suffering he endured. Medieval Europe was accustomed to brutal punishments, but the sophisticated machinery of destruction that made his death possible. King Philip IV created a template for institutional annihilation that combined legal manipulation, media control, and systematic torture in ways that would become terrifyingly familiar to later generations. The precedents established during the Templar trials would be refined and repeated countless times throughout history. From the witch trials of the early modern period to the show trials of 20th-century totalitarian regimes, what makes de Molay's story particularly tragic is how completely his persecutors succeeded in their immediate goals while ultimately failing to achieve their deeper objectives. Philip IV got the Templars' wealth and eliminated the order as a political threat, but he could not control the narrative that emerged from de Molay's defiant final moments. The very public nature of the execution, intended to demonstrate royal power, instead created a martyrdom that inspired resistance to arbitrary authority for centuries to come. The technical sophistication of the persecution, the careful coordination of arrests across France, the systematic extraction of confessions, and the manipulation of legal procedures reveal a level of organizational capability that challenges common assumptions about medieval government. This was not the crude tyranny of a barbarian warlord, but the calculated oppression of a modern state apparatus, complete with propaganda campaigns, legal justifications, and bureaucratic efficiency. The methods used against the Templars were, in many ways, more systematic and comprehensive than those employed by many later authoritarian regimes. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of de Molay's execution is how easily a society can be convinced to accept the destruction of its most respected institutions when the right combination of fear, greed, and legal authority is applied. The charges against the Templars were so shocking that most people found it easier to believe them than to question the motives of their accusers. This willingness to abandon critical thinking when confronted with scandalous allegations would be exploited repeatedly throughout history by those seeking to destroy their enemies through character assassination rather than honest competition. The enduring fascination with Jacques de Molay's story reflects something deeper than mere historical curiosity. In an age where information can be manipulated, where powerful institutions can be destroyed overnight, and where the line between justice and persecution remains perilously thin, the Grand Master's final moments offer both a warning and an inspiration. His courage in the face of overwhelming power, his refusal to accept a false narrative about his life's work, and his willingness to die rather than validate his persecutors' lies represent ideals that transcend any particular historical period. The island in the Seine where de Molay was burned has long since been incorporated into the larger landmass of modern Paris. But the memory of what happened there continues to haunt European consciousness. Every generation rediscovers the story and finds in it reflections of their own struggles against injustice, corruption, and the abuse of power. The Grand Master's final words, calling on God to judge his persecutors, echo across the centuries as a reminder that some truths are worth dying for, and that courage in the face of tyranny can achieve a kind of immortality that outlasts all earthly power. In the end, Jacques de Molay's execution represents one of history's most powerful demonstrations of both human evil and human dignity. The sophisticated cruelty that destroyed him, and his order reveals the terrible potential of organized power when it abandons moral constraints. But his final defiance, maintained even as the flames rose around him, shows that the human spirit can triumph over oppression even in the moment of its physical defeat. That such courage existed in the medieval world offers hope that it can exist in ours as well. Whenever the need arises to stand against the darkness that threatens to consume truth itself,